Imagine standing in the middle of a desert with nothing but sand beneath your feet. No river, no green grass, no sade, no obvious source of food, just heat, wind, and thousands of acres of land that most people would consider useless. Now imagine telling your neighbors, I'm going to build a farm here. They would probably laugh. And that's exactly what happened to a woman named Amara. When Amara first bought her piece of desert land, people didn't congratulate her. They laughed. Some told her she had wasted her money. Others said she would be gone within a year. One man even looked at the empty land and told her, You can't farm sand. Amara didn't argue. She simply smiled because she wasn't planning to farm the desert the way everyone thought she would. And 3 years later, the same piece of land that once looked completely dead had become almost unrecognizable. But what happened during those 3 years is the part nobody expected, because Amara's first attempt nearly destroyed everything. And her solution came from something most farmers would never think of putting in a desert: animals. When Amara first saw the property, there was almost nothing to admire. The land stretched across a dry landscape where temperatures could become brutally hot. The soil was hard, vegetation was sparse, water was difficult to find, and there were no beautiful green fields waiting to be planted. To most people, the property looked like a problem, but Amara wasn't looking at what the land was. She was looking at what it could become. She had spent years learning about agriculture, soil, water management, and regenerative farming. And one idea kept coming back to her. Maybe the land wasn't dead. Maybe it was simply trapped in a cycle. The soil had little organic matter. Without organic matter, it struggled to hold water. Without water, plants struggled to grow. Without plants, animals couldn't survive. And without animals and plants feeding the soil became even poorer. It was a vicious cycle. But if she could break that cycle, everything could change. There was only one problem. Breaking that cycle would require water, and water was exactly what the desert didn't have. Amara started with what seemed like the obvious solution. She planted, she bought seeds, she prepared sections of the land, she installed irrigation lines where she could. Then she waited. At first, tiny green shoots appeared. It looked promising. For the first time, Amara could see something green against the brown landscape. She thought she had proved everyone wrong. But then the heat arrived. The plants struggled. Some dried up. Others died completely. The few that survived required far more water than she could afford to provide. And suddenly, Amara realized something terrifying. She wasn't fighting the plants. She was fighting the environment. Every drop of water was disappearing too quickly. The soil was too exposed. The sun was beating directly onto it, and the bare ground was losing moisture almost as quickly as she could add it. After months of work, Amara had almost nothing to show for it. Her neighbors noticed, and the laughter started again. One person asked her, So, how's your desert farm going? Another told her, Maybe you should plant cactus instead. Amara went home that night exhausted. For the first time, she seriously considered quitting. But then she asked herself a different question. Instead of asking, How do I force crops to grow here? She asked, What would nature do? And that question changed everything. Amara began studying ecosystems that naturally survive harsh environments. She looked at deserts, dry grasslands, savannas, and places where rainfall was seasonal. And she discovered something fascinating. Healthy ecosystems don't depend on one thing. Plants, animals, microorganisms, insects, fungi, water, and soil all work together. The animals aren't simply consumers. They can become part of the system that rebuilds the soil. And that's when Amara came up with an unusual idea. Instead of trying to make the desert behave like a conventional farm, she would build an ecosystem. But she needed animals, not cows, not tractors, not expensive machinery. She started with goats. At first, people thought this was even more ridiculous. What are goats going to do in the desert? But Amara had a plan. The goats would eat vegetation that could survive the harsh conditions. As they moved across the land, they would disturb the soil surface. Their manure would return nutrients to the ground. And most importantly, they would become part of a carefully managed grazing system. But there was a catch. She couldn't simply release hundreds of goats and hope for the best. That could destroy the land instead of saving it. So she divided the property into smaller grazing areas. The goats would enter one section, eat for a limited period, then leave. The area would rest. Then another section would be grazed. It was controlled movement, controlled recovery, and the first results were almost invisible. For weeks, nothing dramatic happened. The desert still looked like a desert, brown, dry, empty. Amara continued working. Then one morning, she noticed something. She bent down and looked closely at the ground. There was a tiny green plant growing where she hadn't planted anything. Just one. Then she found another, and another. It wasn't a miracle. It was the beginning of something. The soil around the grazed areas was starting to change. Organic material was accumulating. Plant residues were returning to the ground. The surface was becoming less exposed. And slowly, the soil began holding moisture for longer. Amara didn't celebrate yet, because one rainy season could change everything. If the system couldn't survive the next dry period, all of her work would be meaningless. Then the rain came, and this was the moment she had been waiting for. Dark clouds appeared over the horizon. Then the first drops hit the ground. Within minutes, the dry landscape was being covered by rain. Normally, water would rush across hard, exposed soil. But this time, something different happened. Some of the water began soaking into the ground. The areas with more organic matter held onto it longer. The plant roots helped stabilize the soil. And where the goats had been carefully rotated, new vegetation began appearing. Not everywhere, not instantly, but enough to prove that something was working. Amara watched the landscape transform over the following weeks. Small patches of green became larger patches. The green attracted insects. The insects attracted birds. And the birds brought something else: seeds. Suddenly, nature itself was beginning to participate in the experiment. And this is where the story gets interesting, because Amara wasn't creating every part of the farm anymore. The ecosystem was beginning to create parts of it for her. At the end of the first year, Amara's farm was still far from perfect. If you stood at one end of the property, you could still see plenty of dry ground. There were still difficult areas. Water was still precious. And the farm wasn't producing enough food to make everyone believe in her idea. But there was one major difference. The land was no longer completely bare. Vegetation was beginning to return. The goats had food. The soil was improving. And Amara had learned an important lesson. She didn't need to turn the entire desert green. She needed to create conditions where life could gradually return. That distinction changed her entire strategy. Instead of trying to conquer the environment, she started working with it. She planted drought resistant crops. She collected organic material. She protected the soil from unnecessary exposure. She expanded her grazing rotation. And she became obsessed with one thing: water. Not finding more water, making every drop count. Amara began changing the way water moved across the property. Instead of allowing rainwater to disappear immediately, she created small earthworks and channels designed to slow down runoff and encourage infiltration. She used mulch and organic matter to reduce evaporation. She planted vegetation strategically. She created areas where water could collect naturally. The goal wasn't to flood the desert. It was to convince every drop of water to stay a little longer. Because in a dry environment, a few extra hours of moisture can make a huge difference. Then something unexpected happened. The farm started producing more than Amara expected. Not just forage. Food crops began appearing in selected areas. The goats became healthier. The soil became darker in places, and the number of plants increased. But there was still one problem. The people around her weren't convinced. Not yet. By the second year, the transformation was becoming visible. Anyone who had visited the property before could immediately see the difference. The ground wasn't uniformly green. This wasn't some magical movie where a desert suddenly becomes a rainforest. It was more subtle, but it was real. There were more plants, more ground cover, more insects, more birds, more organic material, and more life. The goats were moving through sections of the property while other sections rested. That rotation allowed vegetation to recover. And as the plants grew, their roots pushed deeper into the soil. Those roots helped create pathways for water. The soil became more biologically active. And slowly, the farm was becoming less dependent on constant human intervention. Then Amara noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. She dug into a section of soil that had once been almost lifeless. And beneath the surface, there was moisture, not a flood, not a miracle, but moisture, the kind that disappears almost immediately from exposed desert soil, was now remaining underground longer. That was the moment she knew. The system was beginning to work. Word started spreading. People who had once laughed at Amara began visiting the farm. They walked around quietly. They looked at the goats. They touched the soil. They looked at the plants. And then they asked the question Amara had been waiting for. How did you do this? But Amara didn't give them a secret formula because there wasn't one. The transformation had come from dozens of small decisions repeated over time. Protect the soil. Keep the ground covered. Use water carefully. Rotate animals. Encourage biodiversity. Plant appropriate species. Allow damaged areas to rest. And most importantly, stop treating the land like an enemy. But the biggest surprise was still coming. 3 years after Amara first arrived, the transformation was impossible to ignore. The land was no longer the barren property people remembered. There were areas covered with vegetation. Trees and shrubs had established themselves in suitable locations. The goats moved through green patches of forage. Birds were everywhere. Insects buzzed around flowering plants. The soil had changed, and the farm was producing food. But perhaps the most impressive transformation wasn't something you could see. It was happening underground. Roots were building soil structure. Organic matter was accumulating. Microorganisms were breaking down plant material. And water was being held in the landscape more effectively. The desert hadn't disappeared. Amara hadn't defeated nature. She had simply created conditions that allowed life to return. And suddenly, the woman everyone had laughed at was being asked for advice. Then came the harshest dry period the farm had faced since the project began. Rain became scarce. The temperature climbed. Nearby vegetation began turning brown. Farmers started worrying. And Amara knew this was the real test. Anyone can celebrate when conditions are perfect. But could her system survive when conditions became difficult? For weeks, she watched the land. Some plants died, some areas dried out. But something surprising happened. Not everything collapsed. The areas with stronger soil structure retained moisture longer. The deeper rooted plants survived. The grazing rotation prevented the goats from completely destroying the available vegetation. And the farm made it through. Not perfectly, but alive. That was perhaps the most important victory of all, because Amara had learned that sustainable farming isn't about creating a farm that never experiences problems. It's about creating a farm that can recover from them. 3 years earlier, people looked at Amara's property and saw a hopeless piece of desert. Now they saw opportunity. But Amara saw something else. She saw proof that land can change when you stop asking, how can I force this place to give me what I want? And start asking, what does this place need in order to become productive? Her farm wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fantasy. And it wasn't proof that every desert can be transformed into farmland. But it demonstrated something powerful. Sometimes the biggest agricultural breakthroughs don't come from adding more technology. Sometimes they come from understanding the relationships that already exist in nature. Plants need soil. Soil needs organic matter. Animals interact with vegetation. Water interacts with soil. And every part of the system affects the others. Amara didn't make the desert disappear. She gave life a chance to return. Remember the man who once told her, you can't farm sand. Years later, he visited the property again. He stood at the edge of the farm, looked across the vegetation, watched the goats moving through the fields. Then he turned to Amara, and according to the story, he simply said, I didn't think you could do it. Amara smiled, because she hadn't thought she could either. Not at first. The difference was that when the first plan failed, she didn't quit. She changed the question. And sometimes that's where transformation begins. The lesson isn't that every desert can become a farm. It isn't that goats can magically turn barren land into paradise. And it certainly isn't that farming in extreme environments is easy. The real lesson is much simpler. When everyone else sees a problem, look for the system behind it. Because what looks dead on the surface may simply be waiting for the right conditions to come alive. And 3 years after everyone laughed at her, the land was unrecognizable. Subscribe for more.